For those of you that are new to rereading, what we do is we choose a portion of text. Sometimes we choose a topic, but usually we choose a portion of text. And what I'm hoping to do is, with minimal outside commentaries, is try to listen to the text, and where we need to bring in some outside information that makes a text kind of a bit more understandable, then we'll do that. So it's literally what it's called, rereading. And what I'm hoping to do is not just to give you good, academically solid material. I'm hoping to increase your ability to read text, that you become more confident in your reading of text. Particularly what I really try to model is reading a text within its own literary context. For example, the Sermon on the Mount is a piece of the Gospel of Matthew. And so the rest of Matthew is not disconnected from the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, pieces and features and sometimes clarifications occur in other parts of Matthew. But I do try to limit myself to kind of the most immediate literary context, which is Matthew originally wrote this document. He copied much of it from Mark, but he felt the need to put in 5 large teaching sections. And I've shared with those in the past that there's 5 teaching blocks that are spread across Matthew. In fact, let me just back up. I've got that in the outline that I sent out to you, or in the slide you have this, but let me just go there. In the flow of the Gospel of Matthew, there's 5 teaching sections. And we've talked about how the Sermon on the Mount actually kind of counterbalances the castigation of the Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23. By the way, if I was to redo this, I would turn this red. In fact, I'm going to do it now. And I would make it part of the 5th discourse, because it's a long, extended conversation. But anyway, when you read Jesus's woes to the scribes and Pharisees, you can hear echoes of the Sermon on the Mount. Hey, folks, when we drop into the middle part of Matthew chapter 5, we begin to get these series of, they're usually called antitheses, and I've suggested maybe let's call them interpretations. It's Jesus, and I do think in each of these cases, Jesus seeks to give us a deeper reading on the law, because he didn't come to destroy the law, he came to fulfill the law. And so just because he said, you heard that it was said that you should not commit murder, he's not saying now, by the way, you can commit murder now. Obviously, he doesn't go in that direction. So he doesn't always counterbalance everything that goes in front of his kind of renewed interpretation. And so you find this basic pattern that's on your screen here. You have heard that it was said, and then you get the commandment, or sometimes an expansive phrase that looks like it's commentaries on the commandment. So sometimes you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbors, but hate your enemies. Well, there's no text that says hate your enemies. So, hey, David Boswell, welcome. Hey, David, welcome. And now we're from Fairbanks to the UK. So we've got quite a spread today. So anyway, the pattern of these, and by the way, look for patterns. Jesus will do it again in Matthew chapter 6, where he talks about how to give to the poor and how to pray and how to fast, and kind of the common theme before. They're structured very much the same, but the common theme is you're not to do it as a moment of show. It's not to be about that. We'll talk about that next week, because we want to finish up what we're doing in chapter 5. But look for patterns, because patterns often help you interpret text by being able to see what the author is trying to do in the arrangement of the text. So the pattern is, you've heard that it was said, some commandment, usually it's a commandment, not always from the 10 commandments, and then sometimes kind of an expansive phrase which may reflect Jewish interpretation or some other background. And then Jesus will make a "but I say to you," and the "but" here we talked about is not the big contrastive but all the way on the other hand, it's more like, but I want to tell you more. And so moreover might actually be a better translation for "but" than our translation. So moreover, or And it can even be translated and I say to you, and then Jesus gives what I'm going to call the deeper interpretation. And then what he does after that is he gives us some examples. And the examples are, by the way, I think some of those that we take so deadly serious, like cutting the hand off, is something that was probably to elicit laughter. Nobody had, in fact, we actually counted our hands last week. And so nobody's right hand or left hand has offended each other. And so you got to give Jesus some room to a little poetic license in the way he's framing them. Or he says that if you say you empty-headed one, you're going to be taken to the courts. Well, probably a little overstated there, but Jesus's point, and that's what we're going to go for every time, is what's the point? And the point seems to be, it's not just about surface actions that matter. Righteousness is not a matter of getting the action right. It's about getting the heart right. Even though Matthew never uses that phrase, right? Or Jesus in Matthew never uses that phrase. So I'm going to start. Let's start with making oaths. And by the way, an oath, I've wanted to call this promises, but then it's not really the same thing. A promise is when I say to you, hey, I think I can be there this afternoon, And so it's not intended as an oath. An oath, though, is something that generally has kind of at least in the Old Testament, has kind of a connected to Godness to it. And so an oath would be something that we would swear to. And so let's read Jesus here. Again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oaths, which, by the way, is not a direct command. We'll talk about that when we get to our notes. But fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. In this case, Jesus gives something of a summary that seems to be consistent with the Old Testament, but not exact words. But he's saying, you have heard it was said. So apparently it's part of the teaching venue of the first century. Okay, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, which I think is really interesting because the Old Testament does certainly allow that as a possibility. And then here's his explanation beyond that. Either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.
Right.
Yeah, I've always thought it was interesting, guys, that in Christian culture, swearing on the Bible became a court thing. And I'm going, no, Jesus actually kind of told us not to do that, didn't he? Really? And so, which, by the way, you're not going to see as much of it as you used to, but it is possible simply to say, I affirm to tell the truth without putting your hand on the Bible. Right. But I think Bill is right. Sometimes it allows us to say things we might not say otherwise. But notice also how Jewish it is in terms of its framing. And this is true all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. If you have a gift and you remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave the gift at the altar. Notice how this one is built around God's throne, Jerusalem, and the great king. And so it's very, and so those are hints to me that this is coming out of a pretty hotly debated thing in the first century. Yeah, I think what we learn from it is just say what you mean is the truest thing that you can say. Let's look ahead at, it's not an exact quote, but it seems to be a combination. Let me kind of throw in, it seems to be a combination of Leviticus 19:12, which is basically keep your oaths, and a tie-in with Numbers 30, verse 2, and Deuteronomy 23:21. And so there does seem to be, for Jesus' initial, you've heard that it was said. One can see this teaching as a critique of the religious leaders of the day. And I want to read it in connection with something that also shows up in Matthew and see if it makes more sense why Jesus might be grabbing this thing, why it makes sense for it to be in the Sermon on the Mount. Woe to you, by the way, the woes are incredible, aren't they? Woe to you, blind guides. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. So apparently they had devised supplementary interpretations that basically allowed people to get around some of their oaths. Does that make sense when you get that in the background? I was thinking swearing by the temple is more important than the gold, but anyway, you blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? Of course, Jesus is kind of using Pharisaic logic back with them. You also say if anybody swears by the altar, it means nothing, but if anybody swears by the gift on the altar, is bound by that oath. You blind man, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Once you see what the Pharisees are doing with this thing, and this is basically our only window into it. I don't know much more out there that would give you any more hints on but you can almost feel the kind of rabbi so-and-so says, and rabbi so-and-so says, and rabbi so-and-so says. And Jesus basically says, let me paraphrase, baloney. That's what Jesus says. Baloney. You guys are slicing up things that don't even make a difference. But when you read this text, you kind of, at least I do, I have a feel for why Jesus is saying this. Now, remember, we're going to be introduced somewhere in Matthew to the notion of Corban. Corban was the possibility, was an Aramaic or an Aramaic term for something that was dedicated to the temple. And Jesus will criticize the religious leaders for being able to give a gift to the temple and not take care of their parents. So you bypass taking care of your parents by apparently dedicating this gift to God. And so what you get here is you get an insight into early Jewish interpretation. But what we walk away with is you don't have to swear at all. You just say what you mean. And the notion of trustworthy speech is something that shows up repeatedly in Paul's letters and in other places in the New Testament. In James, for example, that wholesomeness ought to come out of this mouth and not stuff that corrupts. So, by the way, it's actually kind of hard to find ways of saying what you mean if you think about it. You know, when the wife asks you how she looks, you know, there's not too many answers that are acceptable. So we work with relationships, but have you ever had the person in your life who they had this ability just to misdirect every conversation? That is, you were on target, you were having the conversation, and the next thing you know, the conversation went here because the person either had vested interest or was just wired this way. And you want to say, so I'm saying, let's not be that people. Let's be the people that can stay on topic, and let's be the people who can say no. And one of the greatest challenges I think we have in our culture is finding ways of saying what we believe and mean so that it's heard. For example, if you listen to somebody who holds an alternate position to you and you may vehemently disagree, there are people who walk away from you when you don't say anything, believing you agreed with them. So we want to try to help folks by saying, no, what I really mean is, or I usually say something like, I don't see it that way, but I want you to know I really love you. And so there's ways of kind of balancing the conversation, because in our culture, we've come to this crazy time when words don't mean what words mean. Yeah, I think as believers, we can always say, hey, you've given me something to think about. I do need some time to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes we do our worst work when we work off the cuff, right? And so not every question deserves an answer, by the way. There's two proverbs that I love because of they're basically opposites of each other. It says, answer a fool according to his folly. And then the related proverb says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. And then that leaves you to think out, okay, you feel the tension between the two, and it makes perfect sense if you think about it, that sometimes you want to answer, but you can always say, I disagree and I need some time to think about it. But I think the point is, one of the skills that I find missing, habits might be a better way to say it, is it's easy in our culture, at least Western culture, to overcommit. Would you please be the people that are willing to call folks up and say, hey, I know I said I could do this, but I can't get to it. Is there any way we can work this out? Because I find increasingly more people just don't show up and they hope that it gets fixed by not doing anything. But most of us understand what it's like to have commitments and work them out. And again, I think Jesus is teaching us kind of the don't do it for show, like I swear, but you do it out of the heart. Here's what I think I can do. And when you can't do it, renegotiate. Always love in church life when people are committed to certain duties and they just don't show up. The leaders involved in those ministries sign them up for the next time. I'm going, no. Have a conversation. Don't sign them up for another. Because guess what they'll do next time? Yeah. So in some sense, it's kind of an invitation to have the difficult discussions, because we are going to say simply yes or no, as Jesus has put it here. And notice that he says, he gives one more interpretation. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And I suspect in the Greek that could be comes from evil, that is as a generic source, or comes from the evil one, the devil. Yeah, so there's a part behind Jesus's teaching here is that it is a temptation to say more than we can commit. It is a temptation to say more than we know. It is a temptation to not be in the place of humility. And by the way, I do think that Jesus takes us to humility to each one of these moves. Because if I think, I'm really not going to be able to do what I'm committed to doing, you can say, you have to have the courage to say, no, I can't fulfill this the way I thought. And the beautiful thing about Christian community is we ought to be able to negotiate when we find ourselves in those places. And it helps the people that are organizing ministries, if you can't be there, to know as early as you know. Listen, things come up. As we say around here, and we say it a lot, life does happen. So I don't know if that's helpful for you, but becoming people of transparent speech, Annie, I think is a good way to say it. People who say what they mean. Yeah. I do think that Jesus is, in fact, as Jim said, he's really pointing at this ridiculous dicing and slicing that the religious leaders are doing to get around commitments or to get around the use of God's name, which may be a possibility. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. All right. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Notice that this one is equally challenging to do not make oaths at all, isn't it? If anyone, and then the examples, right? So that's the pattern is you've heard that it was said, command or interpretation, but I tell you, Jesus offers his, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. And then he gives the examples, right? If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Wow. Wow, that's a big one. So, by the way, this comes from Exodus 21, 23 through 25, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So there's texts that say this. And basically, it deals in the context originally with kind of a lawsuit situation. Is if somebody poke your eye out, then the judicial ruling would be that that person would lose an eye. And of course, I've often commented, an eye for an eye just ends up with 2 people missing eyes. And so in some ways, it doesn't really redress the original. But, by the way, this notion is deeply embedded in human culture. And I've given you 2 examples here. In the 12 tablets from Rome's history, which comes from about 451 before Christ, if a man broke another's limb, the victim could inflict the same injury upon the wrongdoer, but only if no settlement was agreed upon. Okay. And then the Code of Hammurabi had, if a highborn person should blind the eye of another highborn person, they shall blind his eye. If he should blind the eye of a commoner or break the bones of a commoner, he shall deliver 60 shekels of silver. And so the Old Testament doesn't make the class distinction in it. And so there's something kind of embedded in humanity that says, if you hurt me, I should hurt you to the same degree, or even more, but to the same degree. So, but I think Jesus is actually going to take it to the place where he says, how does this fit everyday life? Because what happens if somebody hits you? What's your next move? And of course, usually the next move is to hit them back, right? And the notion of retaliation or the notion of retribution is right there. But you guys have all lived long enough to know that conflict does not end until somebody's willing to allow themselves to take the last hit, right? So this comes from Amy Jill Levine, who's Jewish in her background, but a Christian interpreter. To be struck on the right cheek presumes, were the striker right-handed, a backhanded slap. I think that's been noted a lot. It is a slap of dismissal and humiliation. And so if somebody gives you the backhand, then you're going to offer the other. Now, I don't know that all relationships will play out exactly the way Jesus envisions here, but he's basically saying he's saying you're not the one who's going to come back and escalate this thing to the next level. To respond to such a slap, the victim has few options and none of them good. Hitting back escalates the violence, and then she offers this. Jesus offers what the biblical scholar Walter Wink called the third way. And by the way, I find Christianity often offering this third way that's neither right nor left, but totally different. In a polarized culture, we tend to have right and left options, but Jesus comes up with something that's different. Rather than escalate the violence and rather than lose personal dignity, face the persecutor by making the violence and so the wrongness of the situation clear. That is, when you invite somebody to strike you twice, you're basically drawing attention to the fact that it shouldn't have happened once. Interesting thought. What looks like humiliation to an outsider, being slapped, stripped naked, carrying gear, becomes an opportunity for expressing agency. By offering the left cheek, the victim resists humiliation by displaying agency and courage. Well, I have some nice reflections. I want to deal with Jesus's examples just a little bit. So the first one is a little bit in your face. That pun was intended, by the way. Nobody laughed, but thank you. In your face. Think about the second one. Verse 40. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Lawsuits are intentionally designed to escalate conflict. We're the people who don't play that game. It's not easy, folks. But God's people are willing to, and I know there's probably limits, and we'll struggle with it together, folks. But God's people are willing to absorb evil because our Master was willing to absorb evil. It's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it? That if somebody wants to take your shirt, go ahead and give them your. Of course, Jesus is basically saying that if somebody wants your outer garment, give them the inner garment too, right? Or give the outer garment as well. So if somebody actually did this literally, they would be naked in the first century. And so Jesus is using a little bit of exaggeration to make a point about the kind of people we are. The next example in verse 41, though, has real application in first century occupied Israel. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. The Roman soldiers of the day could impel people to go with them 1 mile, and you would absolutely shock a Roman soldier if you told him, could I go another mile with you? And so there's a real life application. And so when your enemy asks you to carry their stuff, their armor or their gear, 1 mile, go with them 2. And I think 42 is not a general statement, though Jesus would make a general statement, but it's in this context. Give to the one who asks and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And since it's in the paragraph, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, I think we ought to read it in that context. Jesus will say in other places, if somebody asks for you, be willing to give. But here, give the one who asks you is in the context of someone who's probably hurt you. I think is the best way to understand it in this paragraph. In this conversation, how do you deal with the people who hurt you? So Jesus goes from what is originally, I think, kind of an illegal arrangement, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and he basically says, what do you do? What do you do with the people who hurt you? Do you guys know the case of Botham Jean? Botham was a young man from Trinidad or one of the islands, and Botham was a student at Harding College in Searcy, or Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, but he was now living in Dallas in an apartment, and a white female officer entered his place and said, presumably, that she thought it was her apartment, and the young man was killed, murdered, as it turned out. At the trial, his brother visibly offers forgiveness to the officer, and not only does he express forgiveness towards her, he asks the judge if they can embrace and hug, and they do in court. And if you follow the full story, and I don't know the background of the judge, who was African American, she offered the officer a copy of the Bible. And so there were quite a few very interesting, unusual things that happened in Dallas on that particular day in court. Here's the ironic twist of making sense of what it means to be human. Is kind of at the center of everything. We are made in the image of God. That means even the people who hurt us are made in the image of God. And by the way, I want to express the fact, I know there's been people who have hurt you badly. I know some of your stories, so I know you've been hurt badly. And to ask for forgiveness, to ask to move into that mode of forgiveness before you're ready is asking a lot. And it does take time. And I don't know about you, the folks who've hurt me deeply, I find out I have to come back and forgive them repeatedly over a period of time, and that it's not kind of a one-off. I make the decision, I'm gonna forgive, I'm gonna move on. But our world could really, frankly, use a lot of people that would attempt to embrace what Jesus is inviting us into here. Whether it's a little extra, whether it's walking with. Now, at the same time, I want to say, any of you that are working through deep issues of forgiveness, I understand if you're mid-journey and you don't think you'll ever get to the end of it. I got it. We hear that. But Jesus does invite us into this radical story of forgiveness. By the way, when Jesus teaches us how to pray here in a few weeks, as we look at what we call the Lord's Prayer, his only commentary after the prayer is about forgiveness. It's as if it's the one line he has to revisit before he moves on to talking about fasting. And one of my favorite texts, I think it's fair to say it's one of my favorite texts. It's also one of the texts that, it speaks to me often. Let me say it like that. Paul will tell the Colossians and the Ephesians both, there's a couple of texts like it, but it's basically, forgive as God in Christ has forgiven you. One of the things that I've suggested to you is that Sermon on the Mounts kind of serve as a politic, I've called it, for God's people. This is the way we live together. And can you begin to see how each of these are moving us in a kind of way of being, a way of being that's not characterized by hypocrisy, but a way of being in which the inside connects with the outside and they're the same, And really, in some ways, Jesus is saying, we could do the legalities of it, eye for an eye, but what does a righteousness that's deeper and more significant than the scribes or Pharisees look like? Jesus is describing it. Because at the legal level, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But is there a deeper level of righteousness that Jesus could take us to? unless our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. And so if you had a Pharisaic debate about this, they would say, yeah, his eyes got to go, or cut off his limb. But Jesus says there may be a place for us to go that's even deeper than that. Let's grab the next one, because I know we're at 10:59, but the next one just kind of the cherry on the cake, right? You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, which is in the Bible, and hate your enemy, which isn't exactly in the Bible, but one could read certain texts and come away with that. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Wow. And then instead of giving an example, it's more of the purpose or reason, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans, or the Gentiles is actually the original reading, do that? Be perfect, therefore. And notice the therefore ties it into this paragraph. People go all over the place with the be perfect text. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Let's do a few notes here. Here's Leviticus 19:18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And then Leviticus 9:13. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And the hate your enemy part's not exactly verbally in the Torah, and is certainly part of oral tradition. This is a different way of living, folks. This is not the way our world lives. This is why, Jim, we're confounded when we actually see any motions of forgiveness taking place in our culture. This is what made the Christians fundamentally different. The early Christians would not fight back against the Romans if they were being told they had to recant their belief in Jesus. In fact, by the time we get to the mid-second century, Romans are generally amazed at Christians as they face persecution, because they don't fight back. They announce Jesus. Those that remain faithful will say, I believe in Jesus. And they died with this incredible sense of peace. The Romans noted this over and over again, that these early Christians were the most peaceful people they had ever met. Loving your enemies is what Jesus, and not just your enemies, those who are intent to hurt you. And Jesus, remember the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Those who persecute you, blessed are you when they persecute you because of me. And so I think that's still in the conversation here. The illustration is pretty simple. God gives good things to the bad people, and God gives good things to the good people. We should be like God in this way. By the way, the word perfect is a little bit of a hard word in English, because it means without sin. That's not generally how the word should be translated. I think it should be complete or be mature. And it's particularly in this context. How are we mature like God is mature? Is we bless those who are bad and we bless those who are good. We're like God. And I really do think that this be perfect text is contextually tied to this section. Now, it may reach back all the way through this and be like God in all of these things we've talked about. But I think it fits nicely here, because we just have an illustration. What is God like? God blesses both the good people and the bad people. You look at Paul, and he thinks the end game of the Christian life is you looking increasingly like Jesus. And it is a process, but the end game is, Paul uses the same word that's used here. It's maturity, that we are to grow up in Christ. Yeah. And what does that growing up look like? Well, it looks like ever increasingly becoming like Jesus. And it's the journey. And I think it's fair to say that on this side of eternity, none of us will get to the place where we could say we of ourselves. And by the way, nobody ever did, even the Old Testament covenant lifestyle, apart from God. It was always assumed that God is the one who could give you the strength to do it. And so this life together was never one that we were supposed to. And by the way, let me also remind you that every time you see that, for example, in the screen here, verse 36, if you love those, the you's plural. And the New Testament is just consistently, we just don't see it in English. Sorry about that. That's kind of a limitation of English, modern English, not ancient English. Old English used to distinguish between you and ye. Ye was the plural form. And so this would have been ye. It would have been the plural form. And so even the choice of using plural pronouns suggests that we don't do this as an individual, we do this in community.